Hello, everybody. This is Doug Reeves from Creative Leadership Solutions. We thank you so much for taking time to learn about crisis communication. Before I introduce my colleague, Tony Flock, and our special guest, Tara Goodwin, I want to say a few words about how we're trying to help schools around the world deal with the current crisis. Number one, we're offering free webinars, both for states, districts, or even individual schools to support you on the topics that are most important to you. One of the things that we're hearing a lot about in the last couple of weeks is how in the world do we provide feedback and grading to students during these uncertain times with lots of absences. We had more than 1,000 people participate last week, and we'll do the same for you, even if you have a dozen people. Secondly, we're offering free grief counseling by our colleague, Dr. David Gleason, an internationally known psychologist who is providing support for grief support groups if that's something that your community and your students and staff need. And of course, the subject of today's discussion is crisis communication. To introduce our guest speaker, this is my colleague, Tony Flock.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. As Doug said, my name is Tony Flock. I'll be serving as host for today's webinar. My job really is to help Tara look great, which isn't too difficult, so I've got the easiest job here today. We encourage you to send in your questions throughout the webinar using that question or chat feature in your control panel for GoToWebinar. We'll pause a couple times throughout today's presentation to field those questions, so please don't hesitate to keep those rolling in. And I'll be sure to grab Tara's attention and share those questions with her. We want this to be as interactive as possible. And as you might have heard, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to our website should you want to share this with any of your colleagues who are unable to join today. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce to you Tara Goodwin. Tara is the founder and CEO of the Goodwin Group, a public relations agency whose clients range from professional service companies like ours to professional athletes, educational institutions to religious organizations, and from startups to Fortune 1000 companies. 3 years ago, she founded Crisis Interception, a company that helps leaders prepare for crisis and improve their communications to key constituencies. She delivers keynote addresses and crisis workshops across the country on best practices in worst case situations. And she joins us today to help educators improve their messaging as the COVID-19 pandemic continues its path of disruption. And you will see Tara in the camera today. And in order to give you the best view that you can get of the presentation, she's going to turn her camera off during the actual presentation and then back on when we come to the question and answer period. So Tara, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Tony, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here today to talk about crisis communications in times of uncertainty. And I've been doing this for a long time, and the first question that I ask people is, are you prepared for the inevitable? And there we go. And the answer is no. No one could have anticipated COVID-19 and the absolute disruption that it has made to our daily lives. But we can control some things in this crisis. And I'm going to talk to you about the most important communications that have to get out on a regular basis. And every day you're learning new information that's coming in, and you have to make decisions about whether your school community, whether your parents, whether your fellow teachers need to know this information. So I'm going to help you at least put a framework around a structure for more effective communications. A lot of people have asked me, can you prevent a crisis from happening? And the answer, as we know, given where we are right now, is an absolute no. By definition, crisis is an unplanned event, and it triggers a real or perceived threat to the health, safety, or our environment. And look where we are right now. It is the perfect definition of a crisis situation. But the second piece of this is really important, and I want to focus on this, because if this crisis is not managed appropriately or handled in a way that your audience perceives as being successful, it's going to cause some damage to your school, to your organization, and to your professional reputation. And the reason that I am so passionate about crisis communication is because I have seen all too often organizations miscommunicate or not communicate effectively, and it really causes damage to their overall reputation. And I don't want that to happen to any of you, and that's why I'm here today. So I'm going to start with a little bit of humor because why not? We all need a little bit of a break. And looking at crisis, we've gone through every single one of these cartoons. So as the crisis began, you've got your inboxes overfilled. Is there something I can avoid? Was there anything I could do to prevent it? And we now know that answer is no. And how do I manage it? But all of the inboxes are filling up. And then in the middle of the crisis, looking at the new developments and the uncertainty and all of the different elements and emotions that everyone is going through, sometimes you just want to throw your hands up and just say, help, I'm done. And then finally, after crisis is over, this particular cartoon says, hey, crisis management is fairly easy. And there are 3 buttons: panic, eject, and bail out. And I can tell you that I have been a crisis counselor for many, many years, and I've experienced wanting to push all 3 of those buttons in this crisis situation. But there are some things that I really want to address and talk about through this pandemic and how you can manage. Someone said something to me that was incredibly deep for me. And I just want to read it very, very slowly, because what you do in the next 3 to 4 weeks as this crisis continues could impact your school for the next 3 to 4 years. And it's true that the actions that you take will be remembered, and it will determine whether you're successful or not managing through this crisis. And Crisis 101's rule of thumb is always to be out in front of a crisis and be ahead of it as much as possible. Now, a lot of us were caught flat-footed with COVID-19, and no one could imagine how bad this was going to get. But there are inflection points that are going to continue through this crisis. And we do have the ability to plan for that next wave. And that's what I want to talk about in terms of your communications. The other thing that you should think about is focus on what's in your control. There are things you can control. We can't prevent people from getting sick. We can't prevent people from going to the hospital or even dying, but we can actively prepare for that next wave when the inevitable happens. And you should start thinking about your communications and the types of things that you would say if, in fact, that worst case scenario happens. Right now, I'm counseling a lot of companies, and one of the things that they're focusing on is essential businesses have to make sure that they're operational. They have to keep their staff safe. That's one of the most important things that they do while they're manufacturing whatever it is for the supply chain. But they also want to make sure that they think about what's next. So one of our CEOs put together a draft memo that I worked on with him about what happens should one of his employees get COVID-19. How are the different areas going to be managed? So again, thinking about from a school perspective, there are a lot of discussions right now about whether the school year is over now, whether it's going to reopen. I just saw an alert come in that they're thinking of trying to start opening businesses as of May 1st and then slowly phasing it in. The president has a plan. And so how does that fit into what you're doing? When are you going to make that call, and how do you make that call, and how do you communicate? And then finally, poorly handled crisis. If you don't do this right, it can damage your reputation and it can end careers. And I've seen it happen both in the education side, I've seen it happen in the corporate world. And I hearken back to another crisis that was September 11th. September 11th, 9/11, where the planes that were heading to New York came from Boston. And at the time, the CEO was a 35-year-old woman named Virginia Buckingham. And the worst case scenario that they had thought of was a plane crashing into the Boston Harbor. And what happened was a lot of her managers were in the Midwest at a conference, and they couldn't get back to Boston because they shut down air travel. So all the while, the media was asking questions. They wanted to see the CEO. They wanted press conferences, and she was terrified. She put up her third in command. She didn't stand up to do the updates, and people started getting nervous. They started wondering why she wasn't showing up. Did she know something that they didn't know? And as a result, the acting governor had to step in and run all of the communications, and she lost her job. So it does have reverberations. Sometimes you can't see them while you're in it, but that's why communication is so important. So we've seen a lot of headlines, and I just pulled these yesterday. I was looking at some of the more updated headlines. And in the education space, you're seeing all different kinds of stories. So you have a number of opinion pieces and thought leadership pieces, talking about the inequities in U.S. public education, who has resources, who doesn't, who's online, who hasn't been able to get online, and who's really providing for their students at this time. Then you have other opinions about closing schools is the right move. Then you have others, groups of educators who are saying millions of public school students are suffering as a result of this, and different opinion pieces. Then you're talking about more factual stories, just like standardized tests are being shut down and delayed, and scores aren't being counted for this next academic year when people are applying to colleges because of what's going on. And then you have the stories of hope, or the really good news pieces. I just pulled this one, I think it was from the Washington Post. And in Austin, Texas, a school district deployed over 100 school buses to have Wi-Fi for students that did not have internet access. So schools are getting creative in what they're doing. And the question is, how are you becoming part of that discussion and showing your thought leadership in these difficult times? So what are the 12 steps to effectively communicating in a crisis? And I'm sharing these slides with the group, so anyone who wants a copy of these will have them at their fingertips. So don't feel you have to take notes. But the first thing that you do, so as a new piece of information comes in, whether it's from your governor, whether it's from the health department, whether it's from the president, you have to assess the situation, begin to gather facts, and notify your internal crisis team. And I'm hoping that each of you in your districts, in your schools, has a crisis team. And we're going to talk about that, because the worst thing that you can do in a crisis situation is operate in a vacuum with one or two people making all of the decisions. It's always a good idea to have a team of people that you can rely on with inside your school district to be able to call at a moment's notice to help you make the best decisions with precision. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later. The next thing that you do is determine the response scenario. So as this information comes in, you'll be asking yourself some questions. Does this affect our community? Do we need to issue a response? What are we going to say, and when are we going to say it? And that's part of the response plan that you develop. We're going to be sending out an all-parent email on Monday morning, and it's going to say the following things. And you have to anticipate what are those human questions that are going to come as a result of your communication. And then what you want to do is make sure that the other educators, the other teachers on your team, any internal audiences who need to be notified are notified that you're going to send this communication. Because if your internal team of crisis people have decided that they're going to issue a communication, you need to make sure that it goes all the way down the chain, because the last thing that you want is for one of your teachers to get a call about a communication that they didn't or weren't aware of. Then you prepare the materials and identify your required resources. What kinds of resources might you need? We're seeing all different kinds of technologies emerge as a result of this. GoToMeeting and Zoom have been off the charts in terms of being able to communicate. There are also Constant Contact. A lot of people have used Textedly, which is another software tool online for people to be able to shoot out a text to everyone. And I'm sure each school district has its own communications, but making sure that that's enough for what you need. And then identify and prepare spokespersons. Now, normally in crisis situations, it's usually the head of the school, the superintendent, the head of the school board, whoever has the most, whoever is highest in the food chain. I call it the one throat to choke theory, because you want to see the leader of the school standing up and talking about what's happening, especially when it's an important communication. And then you want to make sure that you establish regular contact with other schools in your district. I've seen often that you have a parent who has 2 or 3 children and they're in different schools, and the communication is different among all of the schools. And if there's a way that you can coordinate that within your districts to make sure that everyone knows what the other community school is doing is really important. So establishing that contact and letting them know that that communication is coming. And then after you go through all of those steps and you have your communication ready and polished, you release it in a timely way. And then you sit back and you monitor the issue and you look at, was it the appropriate communication? Did it strike the right note? Were there any questions that were developed as a result of this communication that might need clarification? And those are all of the things that you need to consider as you are issuing the communication and you receive feedback. After the communication has been received, you sit down and evaluate the effectiveness of the response. Did it work? What can we do better to make sure that it is well received next time? Or if you hit all of the boxes, then you're good for the next level of information. And in this crisis, you're going to have many different points where you're going to have to make a decision. Do schools close for the year? What is the 2020-2021 academic year going to look like? I graduated from Boston University and was stunned to see that they made a decision to not start classes this fall and wait till January 2021. What is going to happen and how is it communicated? And that's the most important piece. And then when you're done, you have to conduct a post-crisis evaluation. And once we get through this, I would urge you to sit down with your crisis team and look at all of the different communications that you have sent at every point in this crisis to determine how successful you were, and then take steps to shore up what you can do better next time. So again, it's a cycle. It's an ongoing cycle. Ideally, you have some preparation and you know what you're going to do if this next piece in the crisis happens. You discover all of the facts, what people are going to say, what you're thinking that parents want to know, what you're thinking students want to know, and then you evaluate what you're going to do, make the decision, issue the response, and monitor. And every time you get a new piece of information that has to be imparted, you follow that model. So I'm going to stop for a minute, and hopefully there are some questions that have been typed in, and I'm going to answer some questions. And I put some up here too in terms of what are some of the challenges that you're facing that you might want to talk about. And I'm going to pop back on with the camera and turn it to Tony.
All right,
let
Doug.
me jump in first, Tara. I really appreciate your emphasis on communication. And one of the things that we're hearing is the need for multiple methods. We can't rely on technology alone because sometimes there isn't technology, or if there is, you might have a parent who needs it and 3 different kids who need it. So you can't rely on that. But what I have heard is people using a combination, as you suggested, of not only email, but text. An astonishingly effective device is the ancient telephone, one-to-one communication. And the counsel I would offer here is that that's not just a great way to break through all the technology barriers and get directly to the people who need to hear it, but it has also been really good for the morale of teachers who crave that one-to-one connection with students. So let's not overlook that. I was just talking to a high poverty school this week that out of 440 students, they had missed only 14. Everybody's getting some kind of communication and responding to it, including when they are using the old-fashioned post office to get supplies, books, and paper, as well as extremely important messages out to people. So let's not settle for technology alone. Tony, what have you got coming in?
So 2 questions that have rolled in just recently. How do we adequately prepare for next year? So Tara, like you were just talking, start with what's happening with Boston University. How do we start to get ready for what might happen that far in the future?
Well, you get ready for school every single year, so you know what steps have to be taken. And you have to figure out where the deficits are. If you're closing school early this year, what is it they're missing? Are there additional skills that have to be shored up? Might they start a little bit earlier this year? These are the kinds of questions that you sit down with your crisis team and talk about, because you know your schools, you know your students, you know the parent community. So as part of that, think about how you're going to plan, because you have to. The time is going to go forward, whether we like it or not, and we're going to have to make some decisions. And they may not be the best decisions, but they have to make decisions at this particular time for the best interest of your community. And once you make those decisions, the key is to communicate in as many effective ways as possible. And Doug's mentioned that there are multiple ways to do this. And you know, there's an important point in all of this, and I have it later in the presentation, but we are in uncharted waters. Everyone here is frustrated, we're confused, we're concerned. And think about the parents in school who are trying to either homeschool their children or don't have the technology. There's a lot going on here that's beyond education. And I think the best advice that I can give you when you're thinking about ways to communicate is always, first and foremost, be human and transparent in the way in which you communicate and relate to them. I got an email today that I was so excited from my son's school district. He's a senior and of course is very upset because he's missing all of the natural things that would go along with being a senior. But they talked about the fact that they're going to do a teacher parade all through the town, and people are supposed to come out on their lawns at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon and like wave to all of their teachers, and they're going to be hanging out of their car windows and, you know, kind of just making everybody feel that they're valued, the students are missed, and the teachers are excited to get back to work. And I think if you look at communication from those types of efforts and making people feel a little bit better about this situation, that's the first thing that you need to do.
Thanks.
I would just add, Tara, that a closed school does not mean closed learning. If there's one equity imperative that we've got to have right now, it is we can't allow no learning to be an option. Regardless of the position of the door of the school and whether it's locked or unlocked, learning has to continue, because if it doesn't, it hurts our disadvantaged students greatest.
All right, thank you. Question, challenges from Priscilla. Priscilla writes that parents are so overwhelmed, we're not getting a lot of participation in the learning opportunities that are offered online. Tara, do you have any ideas to increase participation? We offer both paper resources and online resources, but what else can we do to reach out to parents who are facing a lot of challenges right now?
I think that's a great question, Priscilla, and I think Doug might have hit on it. If you see that there's not a lot of engagement, maybe it's a question of picking up the phone and talking to the parents and finding out what their specific challenges are, because it might be something that could be a quick fix. It could be they might need papers delivered to them, worksheets delivered to them if they don't have technology. It might be that their computer doesn't work, or that they can only let the kid use the computer at a certain time because 2 or 3 other kids need it, or the dad needs it to communicate with his office. So I think digging a little bit deeper and making yourself available and putting yourself out there a little bit more with teachers and communicating with the parent families could help in that way. And the other piece is, I understand that you might not be seeing participation, but I think they are absorbing it, and they might get to it, not necessarily on your exact schedule, but you're giving it to them. And I think that's the most important piece of this.
I would just add a couple of ideas from this week. The general principle is, do not let the ideal be the enemy of progress. So sure, it would be ideal if everybody had internet connectivity and a computer that they knew how to use and everything else. But simply putting Chromebooks in people's hands without the training on how to use it, or without connectivity, doesn't accomplish very much. But here's what I have seen. I've seen community libraries and school libraries step up to the plate, sanitizing the books, obviously, and putting them in safe plastic bags, and getting those books, real paper books, into the hands of kids. I've seen both public television and radio and public access TV stepping up to the plate to do story hours, including story hours in different languages. So kids are able to read the books that they most care about and engage with somebody who's reading to them. I know it's not ideal, but it is certainly better than giving up.
An interesting approach was shared by one of my principals this week, Doug and Tara. The National Guard is helping the local community distribute food to needy families, and so the schools are partnering with the National Guard during the food distribution to do check-ins on their families. Just one more avenue of communication, as you've both spoken. Question from Gary: is it best to wait and see about prom, graduation, etc., or should we communicate a new later date? You know, plan for a new date now, or wait and see? That's kind of the crux of the question that Gary's facing right now.
Gary, that's an interesting question, and I know a lot of schools are struggling with that. And what I would say is that based on the newest information available today, it looks like they're trying to reopen things on May 1st. And I just got that notification, and I apologize because I hadn't been able to read it full tilt because we were starting this webinar. But what I would say is, look, I would wait a couple of days, but I would call your team together because everyone is looking at these events and wondering. There's just a great big question mark. Are we going to have it? Are we not going to have it? And even issuing a communication that says, we just want you to know, we've gotten our online learning together. Everything's rolling smoothly. We have not yet made a decision about graduations and proms. We're looking at the latest information from the White House, from our local governor, from our health department, and we'll be making a decision by insert date here. And we're also looking at possibilities of rescheduling it into the future, or we might be doing something different. I've been talking to our local superintendent about scheduling a drive-through graduation ceremony because the kids, we wanted to do something a little bit special. We wanted to make sure that we could acknowledge it in some way. And so we're looking at a backup plan. Nothing has been decided about whether or not they're going to be able to have a graduation ceremony, but we're planning ways that we can move forward. And I think if they see, Gary, that you're thinking about these things and that you're working it out and you're going to give them a decision by a certain date, that's the best way to go. Because if you don't say anything, that concern and speculation is going to continue.
All right, next question from Daniel in Wheaton, Illinois. We have communications, but what do you do for weak responses, particularly for remote learning of students at home? I think very similar to Priscilla's question.
So again,
this is Doug. I would just jump in on that. That's certainly an issue, and I've seen two very different responses around the country to that. One is to say, well, gee, if we can't get effective computer engagement from everybody, then let's just shut it down. And that's exactly the words that I heard in the conference yesterday. Just shut it down, which meant shutting down learning and shutting down communication. And frankly, that is a terrible idea. If one form of communication doesn't work, let's try the second. If that doesn't work, let's try the third. And please do not underestimate the value, both educationally and emotionally, of simply one-to-one telephone conversations. If we were to engage, I know for our high school colleagues on the line, they're thinking, my goodness, Doug, I've got 200 kids. How can I do that? You don't have to do it alone. But if you take every single staff member, all of whom are getting paid, all the paras, all the staff members, and the professional teaching staff together, we could divide up the student body and make it reasonable that every single person gets a one-to-one human contact, and that is vital to keep the learning going.
And to piggyback on what Doug just said, you could have a script written so that everyone is saying the exact same message, obviously in their own way, but they're sticking to the bullet points of what you're doing. You're checking in on the family, asking how they're doing, asking how your student is doing, and then talking about the challenges. And that would be a great opportunity to share information and make future decisions, whether it happens to be getting books to them in a different way or looking at ways that you can continue to promote the learning environment.
And a comment from AJ, who one of our participants, who states that one big takeaway for him has been that every staff member in the district must be a part of the solution in educating students and checking on their well-being. Doug, just as you said, all hands on deck. All right, and ladies and gentlemen, please keep those questions and comments rolling in. We'll have another opportunity in just a bit where Tara will pause and we'll field additional questions. So thank you for your participation. Please keep the comments and questions.
Excellent. Oh. Tony, did you give me control to advance?
You still have it.
Okay, because for some reason, I can't get off this slide now.
If you'll slide down to, there you go.
I got it.
Technology, wonderful when it works.
It certainly is. So, and I apologize, I'm using a computer that I'm not familiar with for this technology. So I talked to you about your internal crisis team, and again, looking at people and positions that should be on your crisis team to help make these decisions, or divide and conquer, as we talked about. So yeah, I just took a quick look at average schools' organizational charts and looked at the types of positions to be on the team. Obviously, it's the superintendent. That is the person who leads the school. Deputy superintendents, for another point of view that maybe has a different insight into what's going on in the school system. Some of you have outside legal counsel and outside communications counsel. Those two positions are really important because lawyers don't want to say too much, and communications people want to say, they want to over communicate. So you have to have the lawyer and the communications person looking at this communication from both angles to make sure that people are being communicated to in an effective way. Obviously, having an IT person at this particular time in a crisis is important, and looking at other positions that might be helpful to you, whether it's transportation, special education, facilities, different department heads, the people that you can rely on in a crisis situation. And there's one person that I talk about that should be on a crisis communications team that nobody really acknowledges, but it's really important. And it's the one person who's very professional, does an excellent job, but might clash with you a little bit, because they're the person that might raise the issue that no one else has thought about. And that's important for a crisis team as well. And if you do nothing from this presentation other than start to form an internal crisis team with some of these positions, I think it will serve you well as we continue to navigate through this crisis. So what I've talked about clear, concise communications in a crisis situation. And here are some key questions. So let's assume there's a notice that you have decided that the school year is going to conclude at a certain date, and you're going to stop learning, you're not stop learning, but you're going to end the school year at a particular time. So what you have to look at is the different questions. How is this impacting us? How is this going to impact our students? Does it change what we're currently doing? No, we're going to continue to teach, and we're going to continue to learn, and we're going to give them suggested things to do over the summer to prepare for the fall. Do we need to issue communications to parents and stakeholders? Yes, we have to inform them that the school year will end at a certain date. And then, are there other ideas and resources that we can activate to help them at this time? What kinds of things can we look at for other activities, and how do we wind this down in a way that people feel that they have, in fact, completed the school year? And I think that's what a lot of districts are struggling with right now. The other piece of the communication triangle is thinking about what your audience wants to know, what those parents and students want to know at this time. And the one thing about communicating in a crisis is that facts fight fear. So the more factual that you can be with the decisions that you're making will make people feel better and alleviate some of the stress that each of the parents happens to be under at this particular point in time. Obviously, people are looking at their own community and COVID cases. I get daily notifications how many people in my town have been diagnosed with COVID-19. They might ask, are there any cases in our town, in our community? Should I be worried about what's going on? What are you doing to continue to keep the students and your community safe? What do I do with my son or daughter as this continues? Are students going to lose their academic advantage? How can I provide for them when they're missing so much school and ensure that they're ready to start the next year off? What kind of online learning platforms are available? And I can tell you some of the best schools weren't prepared for this situation, and they're still playing catch up right now. And as long as you're communicating what is going on and what the students can expect and what parents can expect, because the unknown is filled with fear. If you can take some of that concern and those worries away by your communications, you're doing a great job, even if you don't have all the answers. So this is the message triangle when you're structuring the communications that need to go out to your community. And the most important piece is the human angle. And we talked a little bit about that. And I think my colleague Tony wrote a great blog about focusing on that one thing. What is that human angle that people are struggling with? What are you struggling with personally that you can share with people? They want to know they're not alone. So you have to take all of those human angle points and put that on one side of your triangle. The other side of the triangle is the factual angle. What are the facts that we're trying to communicate at this particular point in time? And those two points give you the bottom line messaging that you're trying to impart. And so as you structure your communication, just follow the 4 key bullet points to help you be as effective as possible. And so you always start the communication with being human, expressing concern and empathy. We hope you and your family are doing well during this time. This is unprecedented. This is an unprecedented situation, but as we continue to navigate through this, we're here with you, and we're here to provide support to you and your family and your child. And here's what we want to do for you. And then answer and explain what you're doing as clearly and concisely as possible. And I hearken back to journalism using who, what, where, when. You can also put the why and the how if you know, but sometimes that doesn't develop until later on. And then they want to know what actions are being taken. What is the school district doing as a result of this new news? And then, do I need to be updated? Is there additional communication that I should expect? Tell me what's coming down the pike so I know, and I can plan that I'm going to hear back from you. If you tell me that you're going to respond to us next Wednesday at 5 o'clock, I'll be waiting for that communication. So let them know that you are a consistent lifeline as you continue to communicate. So I'm going to stop at this point and just ask if there are any questions, and I'll turn my webcam back on.
So, sorry, I was scrolling through. One question that came in from Cora was in reference to the May 1st date that you shared. She wanted to know which states you were referring to, and that was Massachusetts, where you live, wasn't it, Tara?
Yes, it was Massachusetts where I live, and I think there's something national that there is a plan to reopen the country, and I saw an alert that came in, but I didn't have time to read through it. So I would just say check your local news sources to see if there's latest news about when the country is supposed to reopen, because I think they're going hand in hand with that.
All right, thank you.
And this is Doug. I think one of the things that Tara said that was very wise is a date to make a decision is as important as the date. So, for example, there are some people who are saying, we don't know when we're going to open, but we are going to make a decision on May 1st. So people at least have some level of certainty. The other thing is that I don't know very many people who are saying that the country is going to continue to shut down, for the next year. For the most part, I mean, there are some of those voices, but I think for the most part, people are fairly confident that some of these things, like including proms and graduations and professional learning meetings, can happen in July of 2020. I also know of school systems that are already planning for the spring of 2021, and then working backwards from that to say, if this is what we want to accomplish by spring of 21, how do we work backwards to assure that that happens? And finally, one thing that is weighing very heavily on the minds of teachers and administrators is, if I've got students who are going to be at least a third of a year behind, if not more, in the fall of 2020, then how do I focus the curriculum so we don't have people just frantically trying to cover everything, which is completely unrealistic. Sometimes state tests lead people to the feeling that they've got to frantically cover everything. It's just not true. Power standards were important before this crisis happened, and power standards are especially important now. And that helps leaders and helps teachers focus on what matters most.
A comment from Veronica in reference to Doug's suggestion of bringing all staff on board. She mentioned that that's what they had done in their district. Some classified staff have volunteered and are making weekly phone calls to certain students. Tara, a question that came in from Karen: should a parent or two be included on a school or district crisis team?
Oh, I struggle with that. Maybe it's a former parent, because I've seen the rumor mill, and different parents can sometimes deputize themselves as I know everything. And if they're on the crisis team, that could beg questions. Why wasn't another parent chosen? So my gut tells me from your question that I would limit it to the school personnel and leave it at that. I think that is probably the best course of action.
Would it be a good idea, Tara, to have maybe kind of a test audience of some selected parents to see how the communication is being received prior to broader dissemination?
Yes, actually, you could do that. And you could, because you will have made the decision, you know that the communication is going out. So you could have a parent resource team that you could send it out to and say, we think we've thought of all of the potential questions, but as trusted parents, we want to make sure that this is hitting the right note. Can you tell us if there's something there that we might need to modify? And that's a great idea, Tom.
All right. So clarification from Dorothy. She asked that you explain why we do not provide a why and a how when providing information to the audience.
A lot of times in crisis, you don't necessarily know those answers to the why and how. If you do know the why and how, you can provide it, but sometimes that is revealed later on in the crisis, and it all depends on what you communicate. So that's why I say stick to the who, what, where, when. If you know the why and how, you can add it in your communication, but often there is one or both of those that you don't have the answer to.
All right, from Diane, and Diane, I think this is a follow-up for a later time, but she'd indicated that she'd like to hear Doug's thoughts about grading. So Doug, I'm going to send her the link to your recent webinar on that topic.
I'll be happy
Uh,
to, but that is such a hot issue. Let me just address it very briefly because it's
okay.
a huge controversy raging across the land. Um, a general idea, and I think this also is associated with what Tara said, is what you can establish, even when you don't know the details, are the principles that will guide the policy. So principles such as fairness and accuracy, I think, are at the very key to grading. So the nuts and bolts and where the rubber meets the road are the following. Um, I know people are reluctant to give grades when kids are not there. So the principle is do no harm. For example, if you have students who are doing well through early March, but then have been out of communication, you don't flunk them because they didn't have access to technology in March. You go ahead and give them credit for what they did. Conversely, however, if you have a student who was struggling but now really is thriving in this environment, don't withhold the opportunity for them to use that diligence and hard work to improve themselves. In other words, our current situation shouldn't hurt a student, but it should be able to help a student. Now to the gritty details that people are arguing about. A lot of people are defaulting to pass-fail grades for the spring of 2020. That's fine for K-8. I think it's terrible for high school. And the reason is that high school students need a transcript. They need and this is particularly true for our disadvantaged students who the only way they're going to get to college or technical school is with a transcript competing for scholarship dollars. Compounding that is that with the stock market crashing, scholarship dollars are going to be fewer than they were last year. And so to deny students the opportunity to have a full transcript, including grades, is taking away the opportunity to compete for scarce scholarships and college admissions. And that is something our disadvantaged students need most. So I know a lot of people are going to pass fail. It's a mistake because what that means is there's no difference between an A and a D. And that robs the student who is really trying to excel and work hard and work through this crisis. Finally, there's an emotional issue. It's not just about academics, and it's not just about money. It's about emotional resilience. And part of what we want to do is reward students for working hard, for persevering, for being resilient, the very social and emotional learning that we all need. I realize this is a controversial stand, and many thoughtful people disagree with me on this, but my guidance is pass-fail for K-8, but grades for high school. And footnote, make sure those grades are based on the latest and best evidence. No averages, no grading homework, no zeros, no punishing kids in May for the mistakes of January, the latest and best evidence.
All right, thank you, sir. And Diane, hopefully before the webinar is over, I can find the link to that and share where that is posted for you on our website. So a comment from Cora, and she offered the suggestion to avoid generalized statements about when schools might be reopening. She mentioned that her governor is moving 2 weeks at a time and want to make sure that you know, nobody thinks that he's not being transparent in his comments. And Tara, I wholeheartedly agree, and believe I heard you encourage folks to check with their state and local governments for specific information about their location.
Absolutely. That's the best source of information that you can get. And being in line with what your governor is doing and you're reiterating it, making decisions for your school makes perfect sense. And if you don't have that guidance and you have to make your own decisions, then I like the idea of really setting a date that you're going to communicate by and say, you know, we're looking at everything right now, including these 4 things. We're going to make a decision on them by X. And even if, you know, you make a decision on 3 of them and then you have to delay the other decision, as long as you explain why you did what you did, it's fine. And it's better to issue more communication than less at this particular point in time when everyone is, you know, at a different place mentally, for sure.
Nature abhors a vacuum. We'll make our own stories up if we don't have one to share. A
You know,
comment, go ahead.
no, I just said I've seen that happen. And that's an excellent point, Tony, because if you're not filling that void, that vacuum will be filled with speculation. And you want to make sure that you're always setting the record straight, because I'm sure many of you have had to deal with parent rumors or other rumors that have spread through social media. And I was going to talk about that at the end of the presentation to make sure that you monitor, not answer everything, but monitor social media, because usually that's where all the discord or confusion starts to bubble up.
Thank you. And a comment from Danielle in Connecticut, who mentions that she's hoping that in this time of good weather, we can use this experience to plan for bad weather incidents where schools close for single or consecutive days, snow days there in Connecticut. She mentioned she feels that we should rarely have to extend the school year and dramatically change schedules if we can figure out a way to keep learning fluid.
And that might be one of the silver linings in all of this, looking at better ways that we can get messages to our students and maybe save some of those bad weather days, for sure.
And Doug, on a lighter note, Leon wants to know why you're not wearing a bow tie today.
Oh, Superintendent, you got me. My goodness.
All right, Tara, that's it for the questions and comments at this point.
All right, I'm going to go back to the presentation. Yeah. This is something that I saw on Facebook that was shared in a parent group, and it's from a district in Arizona. And it's not the full communication, but I thought it was so incredible because it really addressed the human side of this. You know, I mean, social media makes us all feel inadequate at times. You know, you see like the perfect people with the perfect life, and that's not the reality, and we all know it. And so an Arizona teacher had posted this and sent it to parents, and it went viral, talking about advice for people kind of thrust into these homeschooling shutdowns. And it said, you know, okay, this is not normal. These are unprecedented times. People are anxious. They have to grieve. Give yourself grace and understanding. The veterans in education are struggling because all that we know has been just ripped away from us. So give yourself a break. And I thought it was just the most real communication that you could possibly issue, because here's someone who is completely empathizing with what's going on and understanding that we're all in the same boat together. And I think if there's a way that you can incorporate a little bit of that into your communications, it would be very, very appreciated. This is another resource that I have seen out there, and I live in Massachusetts. There's a community in Massachusetts called Hingham, and they posted this on their local school's website, which are other resources that parents and caregivers can look to that can help about ways to talk to about the coronavirus, how to educate your autistic student and talk to them about what's going on. Other resources for distance learning. Doug mentioned earlier that public television stations have been taking the lead in doing story time and other learning modules. And so there's a link to that for our local public television station in Massachusetts. So any resource or article that you see that you want to share, put it on your school's resource page and direct that in your communication so parents have other options, because everyone is looking for ideas and answers at this time. I talked a little bit about social control and monitoring, and every school district, every town has its own town Facebook page or Instagram or Twitter. and it can be a great way to communicate, and it can also be frustrating. And I would suggest that you have someone on your team who can monitor the social chatter, because it's really important. You want to make sure that nothing is blowing up or coming to the surface that you need to address. I don't say answer or engage in every social post or be defensive, but if there's something that you're going to have to head off or put into a larger communication, it's a good place to look to make sure that you're monitoring the pulse of your community. I do a lot of corporate work as well, and on the corporate side, we had a bank that used stacked social media. So they used platforms like Hootsuite and TweetDeck, and so months in advance, you can schedule your social media. Well, one of the managers actually did that, who managed communications, and it was at a time when COVID-19, there weren't even many cases in China, and he had pre-stacked all of the meetings, but he read about COVID-19. And so this communication came out a week ago that said, tired of all this COVID-19 talk, our bank offers the sickest mortgage rates ever. Worst communication you could possibly have at this time. At the time when it wasn't a big deal, he thought he was being smart and clever, and he obviously wasn't. So they had to go back and do damage control as a result. So if in fact you have any communications that were queued up in any way, shape, or form, just double check them to make sure that they're appropriate in today's environment. And then these are just a couple of things that I pulled from my own town's social media pages and comments. Our school it's a very solid school system, but they were completely unprepared to implement distance learning. And as a result, people were talking about all different things. You know, can't we use our local Sharon community TV station to do this? Can't we, you know, provide and normalize education so that we're ready next time? And then we even had people offering that they could tutor children digitally. So it's a great equalizer, but you also have to monitor the pulse of what's going on within your community, just to make sure that there's nothing that you have to address as you continue to communicate. So I will open it up in just a few minutes for the last round of questions, but if there are 3 things that you could bring back to your virtual schools, it would be to look at your team and identify that crisis team to help you continue to communicate as this crisis continues. And then convene the team virtually in a Zoom room or on the phone and brainstorm what's next and how you're going to respond. And then put together a draft of materials. You can start working on ways that you can put together sort of that we're in this together mentality while you issue that next communication. And you can think about whether or not you're going to have proms or graduations, or whether they're entirely canceled, or whether they're going to happen in the summer, or whether they might, fingers crossed, happen on time. Again, you want to be able to have the materials in advance so that they need just a couple of tweaks, and then you can issue them as quickly as possible. So I thank you for joining today. And if you have additional questions and you submit them, I will respond to those questions either in a blog or individually, depending on how many come in, and I'm here to help. And if anyone wanted me to review a communication, I'd be more than happy to do that.
And this is Doug. I just want to add that we're providing a number of free resources to districts all over the country, indeed around the world. Free webinars on subjects like this, as well as grading, grief counseling where it's appropriate, and other one-to-one support. We've done that at the state level, at the district level, and individual schools. So we recognize how tight resources are, and we're doing our best to be of service to you. So please let us know how we can best serve you and your students. Tony, any more questions before we adjourn?
A suggestion for a future webinar that we'll add to our list. Renee indicated that she'd like to see a webinar on how to plan for education recovery, including, Tara, up your alley, the communication involved in that. Dorothy sent a comment in thanking us for the presentation this afternoon and indicated that it was very informative and appreciated our time. And Daniel, I believe a different Daniel, sent a comment in that he has heard retired teachers are offering online instruction for families. And his question is, maybe schools don't have to do all of this alone.
I just want to offer a shout out to my friends in Newark who I know are listening. That is a classic example of one of the most challenging school systems in the country, where they're not just providing education, but food and shelter and safety, all these amazing things that they do. And yet they have national debate champions. And yet they send kids to Harvard. And yet they're doing all these great things in the midst of disadvantage. That to me is a beacon of hope that really represents how you respond in a crisis, not by cowering and not by folding, but by continuing to fight the good fight. They are the Churchills of our generation. And I know that there are many of them, but I just want to give a shout out to them because I know they're operating under battlefield conditions, and I deeply respect that.
Yeah, and funny you should mention that. Dorothy said hello from the Newark Board of Education, Dr. Reeves. And Lisa and Deirdre Tarabo said thank you very much for the great information. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, we appreciate your time. I'll turn it back over to Doug and Tara for any final comments. Thank you from my end for giving me something to do and fielding questions and for your participation.
We deeply appreciate your time. Tara, I'll give you the last word.
Sure. President John F. Kennedy told us that the Chinese have two brushstroke characters for the word crisis. One means danger and the other is opportunity. Recognize that we are all facing danger, some of which is unknown, but we also have the opportunity to be better leaders, better educators, and better communicators. And I thank you for your time today, and we're here to help with anything you might need.
Thanks so
All
much,
right.
everybody. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, everyone.